These are your slides that you have in your module, and I clicked on it, and the name was Anatomy Unit 5 Slides. And this shows you the digestive, urinary, and reproductive slides with labels. There's another slide group that contains the slides without the labels, and that's used to test yourself to see if you understand and remember the material. So I'll go through these slides with you, and what I normally do is go through the checklist. So this is the checklist also on the module, and you can see with the slides, I need to know esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then we get into some of the accessory glands, the parotid, salivary gland, the liver, the kidney, the ureter. The kidney and the ureter, of course, start the urinary system. The testis, the ovary, is part of the reproductive system. So back to the slides here. I'll run through the slides with you. This is esophagus. We know it's esophagus because we have this layer here is stratified squamous epithelium. Let me see if I can work the little pen here. And I can't write very well with this, but stratified squamous epithelium. And that's all this layer here. And that's how I can tell it's esophagus, basically, because the tissue will change as we move on. Let me erase this, and I'm going to show you the layers. The layers now, I have a diagram or a drawing that I put up, and it lists the layers of a typical digestive system, starting with the tunica mucosa. And if you notice here, we go back to the slides here. I'll just show you the stomach for an example. We have tunica mucosa, we have tunica submucosa, tunica muscularis, and tunica serosa. And those standard 4 layers are usually repeated as we go through the small intestine, the large intestine, and so forth, with some differences, but mostly that's what we'll see. So let's go back to the slides here. We have the tunica mucosa. Mucosa is the layer that forms the epithelial layer. See, mucosa is probably the same thing as the epithelium. And then we go down here to tunica submucosa, and we see that in the tunica submucosa, we start to see some blood vessels. That's how we can tell that we are in the tunica submucosa. You do not have any blood vessels in the epithelial layer, which is the tunica mucosa. So this is submucosa, below the mucus layer, see? And that is the 2 layers so far that we can see with the esophagus. We go down to the next slide. We see stratified epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium of the mucosa of the esophagus. And you can see how flat these cells are. And we basically, we just know those 2 layers for that slide. We don't have a slide of the lower layers. And then we have stomach mucosa. We have stomach mucosa. If you look at your checklist, you have tunica mucosa. We have simple columnar epithelium. And we are going to be finding the gastric pits and the rugae in the tunica mucosa. And we're also going to find the layer of connective tissue, and there's a little band of muscle that's still within the mucosa. It's called the muscularis mucosa. So here we have the epithelial layer, the mucosa, and you can see the folds that we see in the stomach is called rugae. This is one ruga, and the folds are usually on an empty stomach. And we see here that this is an empty stomach, so it has a folds. When we have a full stomach, these folds stretch out and you don't see the folds anymore. And so here would be a gastric pit. As you were probably learning in your lecture, the gastric pit contains different types of cells that produce the different material for digestion. There's a group of cells that produce the hydrochloric acid, and there's a group of cells that produce the pepsin, which is the enzyme that digests protein. And then we have a group of cells that produce mucus, a group of mucus producing cells. So the different cells you can learn in your lecture, but we won't be doing that. We won't be learning the specifics here in the slides. So this is the mucosa of the stomach. And then we go down a little bit, just below that mucosa, we see that there's the pits that we saw earlier. These pits here keep going down, and even though it's a different color here, there's the same pits. They come down here, and you can see we're starting to get to the very, very end of the mucosa, and there's a band of smooth muscle here that's called muscularis mucosa. The muscularis mucosa is what's going to help to make those folds or rugae in the mucosa. The layer below the mucosa is called the submucosa. So, and we go down a little bit more, and this is submucosa. We start to pick up some blood vessels, which is hard to see in this. There's a little bit of a blood vessel right here, but it's a little difficult to see. And below the submucosa, and the submucosa, basically the function of the submucosa is to bring in blood vessels and those kinds of things to diffuse nourishment and oxygen and get rid of wastes and stuff for the upper layer of the mucosa. The tunica muscularis is the first layer of muscles that we see here. This is its own tunic, and tunica muscularis usually has a couple of muscle layers. They have circular muscles and longitudinal muscles, and in the stomach there's a third layer of muscles. When we continue to go to the tunica muscularis, we can see the muscles here. Some more muscles. These would be the longitudinal muscles. And then a little bit lower than that, the muscle layer stops, and then we have the serosa. So this is tunica serosa, and again, we have blood vessels and things that we can see. There's blood vessels and sorts in the muscularis, but sometimes we don't see them as often. But they're there, and here's a nice blood vessel with some blood cells. Okay, so there's our serosa. And we go down to another, now the slide is going down to the small intestine, and we can tell we're in the small intestine is because we have these very long villi. You'll see some more of these villi as we go along, with these long villi. They're lined with simple columnar epithelium. You can see some goblet cells there. The layer in the middle of a villus, singular, is connective tissue, sometimes called the lamina propria. If you ever see that word, let me get my little pen going here. Lamina, I wonder if I can text. No, probably not. So lamina propria, that's the connective tip. Propria. And that's the connective tissue. Okay, don't forget when you're taking a test, you don't want to abbreviate. You want to write the words out, okay? But that's another word for the connective tissue that's found in this area. Is the lamina, the layer, proper, okay? The proper layer, connective tissue, okay? Let me get rid of that. And stop my pen so we can move on. And now we're going to go down to the small intestine, to where we're looking at the lumen, the inside of the small intestine. And here we can see the villi coming up, say the ends of the villi, lined with the columnar epithelium, and also the lamina propria or the connective tissue. And you can see the villi are quite long in the small intestine. That's how we know we're in the small intestine. A close-up of that, we can see we have the epithelial layer, which is simple columnar epithelium. We have the what's called a brush border, which is microvilli. So maybe I'll get a little pin going here, and this would be the microvilli. Okay, which means that the cells here, you can't see them very well, but the cells here have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of little folds, see? And that creates the microvilli. And we don't see the folds like that in a light microscope. We just see it as this band like you see here. Also present, before I forget, is this side here, this layer here, is the basement membrane. And that's a review of your epithelial tissue, basement membrane. Okay, so that's a nice close-up. Oh, goblet cells is labeled for you already. There's a goblet cell that produces mucus that helps to protect the lining of the intestine from being digested. Because remember, there's a lot of digestive enzymes in here. The function of the small intestine, the function of this type of tissue and small intestine is to absorb nutrients. So the nutrients that are being digested from our things that the things that we eat are being digested, and the monomers, the simple molecules, are being absorbed into these cells and then passed on into the blood vessels that are found in the connective tissue. Remember, there are no blood vessels in the epithelial layer, but there are in the connective tissue. Okay, so we move on to the bottom or the lower portion of the small intestine, and there we can see we're getting at the end of the tunica mucosa. We start the muscularis mucosa. Again, this is still part of the tunica mucosa. This is a layer, a band of muscles that helps to fold and move the shape of the small intestine in this case. So this is the muscularis mucosa. And then we have a submucosa with a very nice blood vessel there, so you can tell what you're looking at. And another blood vessel here, looks like a big vein. The tunica submucosa. And we continue down, we go to the tunica muscularis. There's the circular muscles here, and the tunica muscularis, the longitudinal muscles here, cut in cross section. And we continue down to the large intestine. Large intestine is the last piece of your digestive system. And here we have the large intestine is loaded with goblet cells. That's how you can tell you're in the large intestine. There's lots and lots of goblet cells. These goblet cells, if you forget what they are from the previous drawing, this would be a goblet cell here. Oops. Okay, that's enough. Let me get my pen here. Here's a goblet cell right there. See, that's a goblet cell. Again, producing mucus for the large intestine. And we go down to the very bottom of the mucosa of the large intestine, and we see the muscularis mucosa. And now here's a little quiz question for you. What layer do we see here? Okay, we've finished with the tunica mucosa here. We've got the epithelial layer with its connective tissue, and again, we still have the same kind of cells that are lining these. These are the simple columnar epithelium. There's a connective tissue in between there. Lots of goblet cells. The muscularis mucosa, and then that's the mucosa, tunica mucosa ends What is the layer below the tunica mucosa? There's a nice big blood vessel, right? Tunicum submucosa, very good. And so we continue down the tunica submucosa. We get to the tunica muscularis. You can see these fibrous, and there's some nuclei of the smooth muscles, circular muscles of the tunica muscularis, longitudinal muscles of the tunica muscularis. And we go down below the tunica muscularis and we get to the tunica serosa. And this is a blood vessel that goes in and out, waving, and we caught pieces of it as you can see it approaching, going up through this. Probably goes here and up here and into the serosa, but I don't know. I think we lost it. But anyway, that's the tunica serosa. The tunica serosa is found in all the abdominal cavity organs because they're lined with the serous membrane. And so that's why we call them tunica serosa. Where we see an organ that's not lined by the tunica, by the serous membrane, in other words, it's underneath the serous membrane and it continues as not in the cavity, then we usually call that tunica adventitia rather than tunica serosa. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for this particular recording because we've done all the slides on the digestive system. And if you would like another slide presentation on another part of the slides, I'd be more than happy to put up another one. I just thought I'd give you a sampling to see if you could use it. If it's usable for you, I can make another recording. I can also make recordings of any of the models. I would just call up the models that you have in your checklist and then go through the models. All of these recordings, of course, take a lot of work. So try to learn the models yourself and try to learn the slides, what you can do yourself. But when you get stumped on something, then let me know. And then you're probably stumped on the same thing that other students are stumped on. And I will be more than happy to make a recording just on those items or the model or whatever it might be that you're stumped on. Those can be really short recordings. I can just look at a model, spend 5 minutes on it, and that will answer your question, help clear up some confusion on the model. But it's easy for me to throw in a 5-minute recording here and there between my other work that I'm doing. I'll be more than happy to do that for you. I'll be more than happy to meet the class in a Zoom video or Zoom session to go over any other models and any other questions that you might have. So let me stop the